Chapter 39, Thor's Visit to Jotunheim, the Giants' Country. One day the god Thor, with his servant Thjalfi, and accompanied by Loki, set out on a journey to the Giants' Country. Thjalfi was, of all men, the swiftest of foot. He bore Thor's wallet, containing their provisions. When night came on, they found themselves in an immense forest and searched on all sides for a place where they might pass the night, and at last came to a very large hall with an entrance that took the whole breadth of one end of the building. There they lay down to sleep, but towards midnight were alarmed by an earthquake which shook the whole edifice. Thor, rising up, called on his companions to seek with him a place of safety. On the right they found an adjoining chamber, into which the others entered, but Thor remained at the doorway with his mallet in his hand, prepared to defend himself, whatever might happen. A terrible groaning was heard during the night, and at dawn of day Thor went out and found lying near him a huge giant, who slept and snored in the way that had alarmed them so. It is said, for once, Thor was afraid to use his mallet, and as the giant soon waked up, Thor contented himself with simply asking his name. "My name is Skrymir," said the giant, "but I need not ask thy name, for I know that thou art the god Thor. But what has become of my glove?" Thor then perceived that what they had taken overnight for a hall was the giant's glove, and the chamber where his two companions had sought refuge was the thumb. Skrymir then proposed that they should travel in company, and, Thor consenting, they sat down to eat their breakfast, and when they had done, Skrymir packed all the provisions into one wallet, threw it over his shoulder, and strode on before them, taking such tremendous strides that they were hard put to it to keep up with him. So they traveled the whole day, and at dusk Skrymir chose a place for them to pass the night under a large oak tree. Skrymir then told them he would lie down to sleep. "But take ye the wallet," he added, "and prepare your supper." Skrymir soon fell asleep and began to snore strongly, but when Thor tried to open the wallet, he found the giant had tied it up so tight that he could not untie a single knot. At last Thor became wroth, and grasping his mallet with both hands, he struck a furious blow on the giant's head. Skrymir, awakening, merely asked whether a leaf had not fallen on his head, and whether they had supped and were ready to go to sleep. Thor answered that they were just going to sleep, and so saying, went and laid himself down under another tree. But sleep came not that night to Thor, and when Skrymir snored again so loud that the forest re-echoed with the noise, he arose, and, grasping his mallet, launched it with such force at the giant's skull that it made a deep dint in it. Skrymir, awakening, cried out, "What's the matter? Are there any birds perched on this tree? I felt some moss from the branches fall on my head. How fares it with thee, Thor?" But Thor went away hastily, saying that he had just awoke, and that, as it was only midnight, there was still time for sleep. He, however, resolved that if he had an opportunity of striking a third blow, it should settle all matters between them. A little before daybreak, he perceived that Skrymir was again fast asleep, and again grasping his mallet, he dashed it with such violence that it forced its way into the giant's skull deep up to the handle. But Skrymir sat up, and stroking his cheek said, "An acorn fell on my head. What, art thou awake, Thor? Methinks it is time for us to get up and dress ourselves, but you have not now a long way before you to the city of Utgard. I have heard you whispering to one another that I am not a man of small dimensions, but if you come to Utgard you will see there many men much taller than I. Wherefore I advise you, when you come there, not to make too much of yourselves, for the followers of Utgard Loki will not brook the boasting of such little fellows as you are. You must take the road that leads eastward, mine leads northward, so we must part here." Hereupon he threw his wallet over his shoulders and turned away from them into the forest, and Thor had no wish to stop him or ask for any more of his company. Thor and his companions proceeded on their way, and towards noon descried a city standing in the middle of a plain. It was so lofty that they were obliged to bend their necks quite back on their shoulders in order to see the top of it. On arriving, they entered the city, and seeing a large palace before them with the door wide open, they went in, and found a number of men of prodigious stature sitting on benches in the hall. Going further, they came before the king, Utgard Loki, whom they saluted with great respect. The king, regarding them with a scornful smile, said, "If I do not mistake me, that stripling yonder must be the god Thor." And addressing himself to Thor, he said, Perhaps thou mayest be more than thou appearest to be. What are the feats that thou and thy fellows deem yourself skilled in? For no one is permitted to remain here who does not, in some feat or other, excel all other men. The feat that I know, said Loki, is to eat quicker than anyone else, and in this I am ready to give proof against anyone here who may choose to compete with me. That will indeed be a feat, said Utgard-Loki. If thou performest what thou promisest, it shall be tried forthwith. He then ordered one of his men, who was sitting at the farther end of the bench, and whose name was Logi, to come forward and try his skill with Loki. A trough filled with meat having been set on the hall floor, Loki placed himself at one end and Logi on the other, and each of them began to eat as fast as he could until they met in the middle of the trough. But it was found that Loki had only eaten the flesh, while his adversary had devoured both flesh and bone, and the trough to boot. All the company therefore adjudged that Loki was vanquished. Utgard-Loki then asked what feat the young man who accompanied Thor could perform. The Alfie answered that he would run a race with anyone who might be matched against him. The king observed that skill in running was something to boast of, but if the youth would win the match, he must display great agility. He then arose and went with all who were present to a plain where there was good ground for running on, and, calling a young man named Hugi, begged him run a match with the Alfie. In the first course, Hugi so much outstripped his competitor that he turned back and met him not far from the starting place. Then they ran a second and a third time, but the Alfie met with no better success. Utgard-Loki then asked Thor in what feats he would choose to give proofs of his prowess, for which he was so famous. Thor answered that he would try a drinking match with anyone. Utgard-Loki bade his cupbearer bring the large horn, which his followers were obliged to empty when they had trespassed in any way against the law of the feast. The cupbearer having presented it to Thor, Utgard-Loki said, "Whoever is a good drinker will empty that horn in a single draught, though most men make 2 of it, but the most puny drinker can do it in 3. Thor looked at the horn, which seemed of no extraordinary size, though somewhat long. However, as he was very thirsty, he set it to his lips and, without drawing breath, pulled as long and as deeply as he could, that he might not be obliged to make a second draught of it. But when he set the horn down and looked in, he could scarcely perceive that the liquor was diminished. After taking breath, Thor went to it again with all his might, but when he took the horn from his mouth, it seemed to him that he had drunk rather less than before, although the horn could now be carried without spilling. "How now, Thor?" said Utgard-Loki. "Thou must not spare thyself. If thou meanest to drain the horn at the third draught, thou must pull deeply, and I must needs say thou wilt not be called so mighty a man here as thou art at home, if thou showest no greater prowess in other feats than methinks will be shown in this." Thor, full of wrath, again set the horn to his lips and did his best to empty it, but on looking in found the liquor was only a little lower, so he resolved to make no further attempt, but gave back the horn to the cupbearer. "I now see plainly," said Utgard-Loki, "that thou art not quite so stout as we thought thee. But wilt thou try any other feat, though methinks thou art not likely to bear any prize away with thee hence?" "What new trial hast thou to propose?" said Thor. "We have a very trifling game here," answered Utgard-Loki, "in which we exercise none but children. It consists in merely lifting my cat from the ground, nor should I have dared to mention such a feat to the great Thor if I had not already observed that thou art by no means what we took thee for." As he finished speaking, a large gray cat sprang onto the whole floor. Thor put his hand under the cat's belly and did his utmost to raise him from above the floor, but the cat, bending his back, had, notwithstanding all Thor's efforts, only one of his feet lifted up, seeing which Thor made no further attempt. "This trial has turned out," said Utgard-Loki, "just as I imagined it would. The cat is large, but Thor is little in comparison to our man." "Little as ye call me," answered Thor. "Let me see who among you will come hither now that I am in wrath and wrestle with me." "I see no one here," said Utgard-Loki, looking at the men sitting on the benches, "who would not think it beneath him to wrestle with thee. Let somebody, however, call hither that old crone, my nurse Ellie, and let Thor wrestle with her if he will. She has thrown to the ground many a man not less strong than Thor is." A toothless old woman entered the hall and was told by Utgard-Loki to take hold of Thor. The tale is shortly told. The more Thor tightened his hold on the crone, the firmer she stood. At length, after a very violent struggle, Thor began to lose his footing, and was finally brought down upon one knee. Utgard-Loki then told them to desist, adding that Thor had now no occasion to ask anyone else in the hall to wrestle with him, and it was also getting late, so he showed Thor his companions to their seats, and they passed the night there in good cheer. The next morning, at break of day, Thor and his companions dressed themselves and prepared for their departure. Utgard-Loki ordered a table to be set for them, on which there was no lack of victuals or drink. After the repast, Utgard-Loki led them to the gate of the city, and on parting asked Thor how he thought his journey had turned out, and whether he had met with any men stronger than himself. Thor told him that he could not deny, but he had brought great shame on himself. "And what grieves me most," he added, "is that you will call me a person of little worth." "Nay," said Utgard-Loki, "it behooves me to tell thee the truth. Now thou art out of the city, which so long as I live and have my way, thou shalt never enter again. And by my troth, had I known beforehand that thou hadst so much strength in thee, and wouldst have brought me so near to a great mishap, I would not have suffered thee to enter this time. Know then that I have all along deceived thee by my illusions. First, in the forest, where I tied up the wallet with iron wire so that thou couldst not untie it. After this thou gavest me 3 blows with thy mallet. The first, though the least, would have ended my days had it fallen on me, but I slipped aside, and thy blows fell on the mountain, where thou wilt find 3 glens, one of them remarkably deep. These are the dints made by thy mallet. I have made use of similar illusions in the contests you have had with my followers. In the first, Loki, like hunger itself, devoured all that was set before him, but Loki was in reality nothing else than fire, and therefore consumed not only the meat, but the trough which held it. Hugi, with whom Thialfi contended in running, was thought, and it was impossible for Thialfi to outpace that. When thou in thy turn didst attempt to empty the horn, thou didst perform, by my troth, a deed so marvelous that had I not seen it myself, I should never have believed it. For one end of that horn reached to the sea, which thou wast not aware of, but when thou comest to the shore thou wilt perceive how much the sea has shrunk by thy draughts. Thou didst perform a feat no less wonderful by lifting up the cat, and to tell thee the truth, when we saw that one of its paws was off the floor, we were all of us terror-stricken, for what thou tookest for a cat was in reality the Midgard serpent that encompasseth the earth. And he was so stretched by thee that he was barely long enough to enclose it between his head and tail. Thy wrestling with Ellie was also a most astonishing feat, for there was never yet a man, nor ever will be, whom old age, for such in fact was Ellie, will not sooner or later lay low. But now, as we are going to part, let me tell thee that it will be better for us both if thou never come near me again, for shouldst thou do so, I shall again defend myself by other illusions, so thou wilt only lose thy labor and get no fame from the contest with me. On hearing these words, Thor in a rage laid hold of his mallet and would have launched it at him, but Utgard-Loki had disappeared, and when Thor would have returned to the city to destroy it, he found nothing around him but a verdant plain. Atalanta. The innocent cause of so much sorrow was a maiden whose face you might truly say was boyish for a girl, yet too girlish for a boy. Her fortune had been told, and it was to this effect: Atalanta, do not marry, marriage will be your ruin. Terrified by this oracle, she fled the society of men and devoted herself to the sports of the chase. To all suitors, for she had many, she imposed a condition which was generally effectual in relieving her of their persecutions. I will be the prize of him who shall conquer me in the race, but death must be the penalty of all who try and fail. In spite of this hard condition, some would try. Hippomenes was to be the judge of the race. "Can it be possible that any will be so rash as to risk so much for a wife?" said he. But when he saw her lay aside her robe for the race, he changed his mind and said, "Pardon me, youths, I knew not the prize you were competing for." As he surveyed them, he wished them all to be beaten, and swelled with envy of anyone that seemed at all likely to win. While such were his thoughts, the Virgin darted forward. As she ran, she looked more beautiful than ever. The breezes seemed to give wings to her feet, her hair flew over her shoulders, and the gay fringe of her garment fluttered behind her. A ruddy hue tinged the whiteness of her skin, such as a crimson curtain casts on a marble wall. All her competitors were distanced, and were put to death without mercy. Hippomenes, not daunted by this result, fixing his eyes on the Virgin, said, "Why boast of beating those laggards? I offer myself for the contest." Atalanta looked at him with a pitying countenance, and hardly knew whether she would rather conquer him or not. "What god can tempt one so young and handsome to throw himself away? I pity him, not for his beauty, yet he is beautiful, but for his youth. I wish he would give up the race, or, if he will be so mad, I hope he may outrun me." While she hesitates, resolving these thoughts, the spectators grow impatient for the race, and her father prompts her to prepare. Then Hippomenes addressed a prayer to Venus. "Help me, Venus, for you have led me on." Venus heard, and was propitious. In the garden of her temple, in her own island of Cyprus, is a tree with yellow leaves and yellow branches and golden fruit. Hence she gathered 3 golden apples and, unseen by anyone else, gave them to Hippomenes and told him how to use them. The signal is given, each starts from the goal and skims over the sand. So light their tread you would almost have thought they might run over the river surface or over the waving grain without sinking. The cries of the spectators cheered Hippomenes. "Now, now, do your best! Haste, haste, you gain on her! Relax not! One more effort!" It was doubtful whether the youth or the maiden heard these cries with the greater pleasure. But his breath began to fail him, his throat was dry, the goal yet far off. At that moment he threw down one of the golden apples. The Virgin was all amazement. She stopped to pick it up. Hippomenes shot ahead. Shouts burst forth from all sides. She redoubled her efforts and soon overtook him. Again he threw an apple. She stopped again, but again came up with him. The goal was near, only one chance remained. "Now, goddess," said he, prosper your gift," and threw the last apple off at one side. She looked at it and hesitated. Venus impelled her to turn aside for it. She did so, and was vanquished. The youth carried off his prize. But the lovers were so full of their own happiness that they forgot to pay due honor to Venus, and the goddess was provoked at their ingratitude. She caused them to give offense to Cybele. The powerful goddess was not to be insulted with impunity. She took from them their human form and turned them into animals of characters resembling their own. Of the huntress heroine triumphing in the blood of her lovers, she made a lioness, and of her lord and master a lion, and yoked them to her car, where they are still to be seen in all representations, in statuary or painting, of the goddess Cybele.